Chapter 1. The World Changes. Terrico's father had always told him that creatures capable of saving lives were generally just as capable of taking them. Humans were the prime example of this, but at this moment, 3 levels down an underground cave, Terrico felt that the carnivorous pitcher plant worked just as nicely. The monster's roots were needed to heal some patients in the village's clinic, but one wrong move, and Terrico would be lying on a hospital bed himself, or worse, in a coffin. Father tapped the Nexi Stone at the end of his staff a couple times to cause the smooth, transparent red rock to shine brighter. The light exposed the pitcher plant near the end of the tunnel in its full grotesque corruption. Looming at least 10 meters tall, the plant filled the entirety of the rocky nook it rested in. Thorny vines ran up and down the walls and ceiling, all leading back to a giant bulbous vessel that constantly overflowed with noxious black and yellow liquids. It stank of vinegar and decaying animals. The stench was overwhelming and made Terrico a little lightheaded. He gripped his long sword tighter and took a couple nauseous steps back, bumping into his friend Turan. "Watch it, mate." Turan slapped Terrico's leg with the flat end of his sword. Terrico shoved the back of his sword's hilt into Turan's stomach, which was well protected by leather armor. Turan let out an exaggerated groan, fell to his knees, and leaned against his sword as he exhaled a slow, dying gasp of breath. "Pay attention, both of you," Father said. "The moment it feels threatened, the creature will lash out at all of us." He slipped out a green Nexi Stone and clipped it into a slot in the center of his sword's hilt. "Best you both stay back a minute." "You'll need help with this, Dad," Terrico said. "I've fought off cavern monsters before." Father planted his glowing staff in a tight crevice in the floor. None this big, not even half this big. Unless Turan's embellished stories of the 15-meter flying shark bush is to be believed. "It was 20 meters, Turan said, still on his knees. Terrico kept from sighing, choosing to maintain focus on the burbling pitcher plant. Some of the creature's vines were sliding up and down the cave walls a bit, and Terrico wondered if this was a sign the monster was awake. It was difficult to discern much when fighting against something without a face. "I can do this," Terrico said. "Use your Nexi Stone to hold back the vines, and I'll rush in to stab the heart of the pitcher." "It doesn't have a heart," Father said. "It will take quite a bit of hacking to kill this thing. How do you plan to avoid its pool of acid?" Terrico pulled a light blue Nexi Stone from one of his trouser pockets and held it up for his father to see. "Where did you get that?" Father asked. Terrico smiled, not wanting to admit he had snuck off on another overnight adventure. The stone was a reward for his efforts, and he was smart enough to save it for such a time as this. His father glanced to the side and smirked. "You take after me a little too well sometimes." "Very well, then. Your mother will kill me, though, if you lose an arm or something. Or scar that pretty face of yours," Turan added. Father turned to Turan. "You watch Terrico's back, and mine too while you're at it." Turan jumped to his feet and stood up straight, his sword raised in front of him. "Yes, sir, Mr. Odysseus." Terrico clenched his teeth and stared the poisonous, jagged creature down. "Have to take it down quick," he thought. "Dad and Turan are counting on me, and so is Mother." As the village herbalist, Terrico's mother was the only one who could create this particular concoction from the pitcher plant's roots. And really, the ones who were counting on him most were the 3 sick villagers who needed this medicine. Terrico had visited them with Mother a few days ago, an elderly man, a young woman, and a 4-year-old boy. They each had deep red boils beneath their eyes and were too weak to speak or even move much. Terrico wanted to help everyone in town, just as his father had always done. Through his skills with alchemy, the Nexi Stones, and the sword, Terrico's father had likely helped out almost every single villager at some point. It was thanks to him that the town took any measures at all to prepare for the possibility of attack from the Shire's kingdom, and Terrico wished to be prepared for such an event. Terrico readied his sword in his right hand and gripped his blue Nexi Stone in his left. "Let's go." He charged down the cavern tunnel. Each of his footsteps echoed increasingly faster and louder. Father and Turan followed behind him, their steps almost harmonizing in the reverberations. Tens of vines leaped off the walls and lunged for Terrico. The monster couldn't hear him, but it could feel the threat in the approaching footsteps across the limestone floor. Father swung his sword forward, forcing a dozen Nexi-powered vines to spring out from his blade. With remarkable speed and dexterity, Father directed each of his sword's thin leafy vines to wrap around the incoming thorn-decked tentacles of the pitcher plant. Terrico kept running for the monster as his father held its attacks at bay. The pallid, fleshy vessel of the plant lurched forward. It leaned down, spilling buckets of black and yellow acids. From within the deep pitcher, the monster erupted a large, messy burst of the liquid toward Terrico. Terrico skidded to a stop and raised his Nexi Stone in front of him. He connected his mind to the stone and felt his blood chill. The air in front of the Nexi Stone turned cold in an instant, freezing the acid spray into tiny ice specks that bounced off Terrico's cloak harmlessly. He aimed the stone toward the ground ahead of him, freezing the deep puddles of poisonous liquid spread across the floor. Two sets of vines rushed for Terrico from either side of him. "Go left, Turan!" Terrico turned to his right and hacked at the vines before they could drive their long, jagged thorns into his neck. At the same time, Turan leaped forward and hewed down the vines, lunging for Terrico's back. Terrico ran for the pitcher plant, careful to keep his footing on the icy floor. More vines were emerging from the monster, but Terrico used his opening to transfer what energy he could to his Nexi Stone. Before the creature could release another burst of poisonous liquid, Terrico chucked the stone into the giant pitcher, freezing all of its acid instantly. The creature rolled forward a bit, then slumped down to its side. Its many vines slowly drooped to the floor around it, and Terrico breathed a sigh of relief. He smiled. "I did it," he thought. "I did it." A sound like scraping glass emanated from the plant. An oozing slit formed down its side, then burst open into large globules. Dozens of thin crimson vines rushed out of the creature, and from the end of each sprouted fly traps, huge needle-teethed mouths that shrieked like a flock of bats. Terrico beat his sword against them, but there were far too many to keep up with. They ducked and swerved around his swings, then jabbed their needles against him. Terrico evaded their attacks as best he could, but he was quickly overwhelmed. The fly traps dug deep gashes into his right arm, down his left shin, across his chest, and onto his back before he could slip away from them. Turan rushed into the herd screaming. With fast, broad swings, he lobbed off several of the fly traps at a time, only for the vines to immediately sprout new ones from their ends. Terrico stumbled back, but managed to keep his feet, despite the stinging pain of his injuries. Another set of thin vines launched for him, but it was difficult to fend them off with his right arm badly wounded. His father leaped into the fray, swinging away faster than Terrico had ever seen of a swordsman before. Father frantically sliced the vines to bits, but new fly traps continued to emerge from the creature. "Get back!" Turan yelled. He leaped back from a swarm of fly traps encircling him, then lifted a red Nexi Stone directly in front of them. A sea of flames exploded in front of the stone, wiping out the mass of fly traps. Instead of fading into the air, the flames rushed down the vines and into what was left of the half-frozen pitcher plant. Turan aimed the stone for the fly traps attacking Father, then forced his flames to rush down the entirety of those vines as well. Turan bent down to one knee, breathing heavily. The crackling fires quickly dissipated into fleeting embers, leaving nothing but a charred, ash-speckled husk of the plant creature. Father walked toward what was left of the monster, approaching with an air of caution. There were no vines left to attack him, but he readied his sword to hack away at the thick, mutilated pitcher. Another tear formed on the plant. A long, bloody spinal cord thrust itself out from the side of the vessel. Terrico stared in disbelief as the set of bones floated into the air, then aimed its long, pointed end toward Father. It looked far sharper than any spear. Father squinted his eyes and smirked. The spinal cord flew for his head. He turned in place. Terrico saw a blur of red and white whoosh past Father. A wave of dust, pebbles, and small rocks flew against Father from behind a moment later. Terrico expected the spinal cord to lunge back for Father again, but all was silent. Once the dust cleared, Terrico saw Father with his sword raised, blood dripping down its blade. The entire sword was glowing a light orange, and Terrico realized Father had switched his hilt's green Nexi stone for an orange one, giving his weapon greater strength. In a split second, Father had positioned his sword at just the right spot for the spinal cord to plow straight through the reinforced blade. Sure enough, Terrico found the spinal cord sprawled across the floor, split into two perfect halves down its entire length. "What was that?" Terrico asked, his voice strained from the pain of his gashes. "Some foul parasite," Father said. "Are you all right, though?" "Yes, I'm fine." "Good," Father said. "A quick lesson then, Terrico. If your goal is to kill something, you have to take extra measures to ensure it's truly dead." Terrico realized he should have done more after freezing all the acid. Monsters were often unpredictable, and you could never be too careful with them, especially when they were this big. "Sorry, I shouldn't have let my guard down. I didn't think it was still alive either," Turan said. "It was just a really weird monster." Father turned to Turan. "You must be ready for anything in the heat of a battle. Your enemy, be it a monster or a soldier, may always have an ability you are not aware of. I imagine that one day you will learn this the hard way. Regardless, you did quite well here, Turan. I didn't realize you had learned to wield the red Nexi so capably. It's a surprise, but I am impressed. Fire is very difficult to control." Turan looked to the side and sheathed his sword. "Well, I have been practicing." Terrico was surprised Father was giving Turan so much credit. Admittedly, Turan did a very good job. He had a knack for Nexi Stones in general, but Father wasn't one who was quick to give compliments like this. He certainly had never praised Terrico much, though in this instance it was understandable, given how badly he got beat up. "Let's cut the roots from the pitcher, Turan," Father said. "We'll want to get Terrico home, so he has time to get his wounds dressed before your classes start." Father and Turan were quick to slice off all the thin, wispy roots of pitcher plant. They were scraggly and hued a sickly light blue and smelled like rotten cabbages. Once they finished removing all the roots, Turan gathered them all in a big pile and carried them with both arms, careful to not lose any of them. "Need any help walking, Terrico?" he asked. Terrico struggled not to wince when he stepped with his left leg. "I'll be fine." "I'll be sure to let Saran know you got beaten up by a plant," Turan said. "Or when she asks about those cuts at school, you can tell her yourself. She'll be all over you then." "Yes, and then I can let all the girls at school know about your little collision with the fluffball bunnies last week. They attacked me in my sleep." When Father started to laugh, Turan was quick to give a detailed explanation of that day's events in some vain effort to save his pride. Terrico's thoughts, meanwhile, drifted to Saran, an elvish classmate he had liked for some time now. A part of him wanted to do a good job this morning for her, too. He was glad to help the village get those roots for the medicine, but he had hoped to perhaps impress Saran a bit as well. He followed Father and Turan out of the cave, his mind filled with concerns for what he would tell Saran at school. It was pointless to worry, but it helped distract him from the pain of his injuries. The walk home felt a lot longer than the walk to the cave, but Terrico managed to keep up with Father and Turan well enough. The sun had risen while they were underground and cast the fields of turnips and onions in a warm golden glow. It didn't take long for travelers to pass through the small town of Adelerston, but the fertile landscape was always a sight to behold. As was typically the case, the air felt misty against Terrico's skin. Even when the heavens were clear, there was almost always a bit of precipitation. In all his 16 years of life, Terrico had never grown tired of gazing across these farmlands. The modest thatched hovels and simple log structures of Adelerston's populace certainly didn't elicit any sense of adventure, but Terrico was grateful for the quiet stability the town offered. He soon came in sight of the central square where the small but bright limestone cathedral rested. It stood as a testament of the villagers' faith in the gods, but also acted as the site for public discourse and special events, including the Long Shadow Festival, coming in a few days. Just a few minutes past the central square was Terrico's home, which also served as a shop for Mother's herbs and Father's stones and potions. Herbalism and alchemy often worked hand in hand, and they usually got a couple travelers a day looking to buy some of their wares. Otherwise, they spent most of their time and energy developing new concoctions, most of which went over Terrico's head. Father opened the door and led Turan to the dining table, which more often than not was covered with lab materials rather than food. Turan set the pile of light blue roots down on a clear section of the table, between a few glasses of orange liquid and a set of loosely rolled up scrolls. Mother sat at the other end of the table, jotting down a few notes in a hand-sized leather notebook. She set it down and stood up to give Father a hug. Father kissed her on the forehead and draped his forearms across her shoulders. "Welcome home, dear," Mother said. "I see you all found plenty of burial." "Should be enough for at least 20 doses, dearest," Father said. "You never fail to impress, dearest, forever. You're the one who inspires me, dearest of all times, all places." Turan cast an exasperated look in Terrico's direction. "I can see where you get your flair for romance." This sort of dialogue was fairly typical of Terrico's parents. It was all sickly sweet, but their smiles were always pure and warm when they tried to outdo each other's praises. Terrico had never heard his mother and father argue with each other. They weren't the type to yell at anyone, and it was rare for people to get upset with them in return. Mother let go of Father and walked over to Terrico. "Oh no, you look hurt." "Giant pitcher plant monster," Terrico explained. "It got a few hits in before it died." Mother pushed back Terrico's right sleeve and looked over the gash one of the fly traps gave him. "Oh, let's get that bandaged up, Sea Scrub." It was a name that always amused Turan, though it only referred to the color of Terrico's dark blue hair. It was a bit of a stark contrast with Mother's light brown hair and Father's golden blonde. Mother said her father's hair was blue, so it was assumed Terrico got it from his late grandfather. A clanging of pots or pans came from the kitchen. Terrico took a few steps to see what it could possibly be and almost jumped back when he saw Saran standing at the counter, cutting up some turnips. She was wearing a light yellow blouse and green skirt, like the sun shining on a meadow. "Oh, hi, Terrico." She gave her knife a little wave, then closed her eyes a bit and gave an adorable smile. Why Saran was here was beyond Terrico, and why she was cooking what smelled like bread and omelets was anybody's guess. All manner of utensils were strewn across the counter, including a dark blue Nexi stone for water and a red one for fire. Father chuckled. "As expected of my wife, no visitor leaves without getting put to work." Mother nudged him in the side. "Oh, it's not like that," Saran said, blushing a little. "I volunteered to help with the breakfast while she finished with some of her calculations for the medicine." "That's very nice of you," Terrico said. "You don't have to come all the way here to go to that much trouble, though." "Oh, I came to drop off some herbs." She gave a tiny laugh. "My brother Lanek had a medicine cabinet full of them, some rare elvish herbs, and we thought they'd be more useful here. I just want to do what I can for our sick neighbors. Everyone's pulling together to help them, and it wouldn't be right for me not to do what little I can, especially when you and Turan are risking your lives fighting those cavern monsters." This, more than anything else, was what Terrico liked about Saran. There wasn't a single ingenuine iota in her heart, and she always put the needs and wants of others before her own. Even since they were children, Terrico had wanted to become better friends with her. Perhaps at first it was the air of mystery about her that attracted him. The elves had such a deep magical lore and culture after all, and he thought Saran was cute too, with bright hazel eyes and long silky red hair. It was definitely the way she conducted her life, though, that endeared Terrico to her. He just needed to find a way to share his feelings for her. "No, it was fine," Terrico said. "Thanks, Saran, for everything. This is really nice of you. Thanks." "A weak performance," Turan said under his breath. "Thanks," Saran said. "It may not be your mother's cooking, but I'll try my best. Everything should be ready in a few minutes." "Okay, Sea Scrub," Mother said. "Go to the other room, and I'll get you some bandages." Tereko sat on the creaky chair in front of the dormant fireplace, while Father and Turan stepped out with their swords to spar for a few minutes. Through the front window, Tereko watched them have at it, and wondered what Father was saying to Turan. Perhaps instructing him on his footwork, or perhaps complimenting him on his skill with the blade. Turan was very talented for his age, and perhaps the best in their class. Saran's brother Lanik was arguably just as good of a fighter, though, and Tereko considered himself rather competent as well. Like everyone else, Tereko would take Nexi Power ranking exams, or NPRs, every few months. It seemed he would always end up with some rotten luck during the tests, though, keeping him from advancing to a higher level. Mother came back with some bandages, a damp cloth, and some healing ointment. "Go ahead and clean your wounds and apply the medicine. I can help you wrap everything up." Tereko rolled up his left trouser leg and soaked up the blood caked on it. Once it was cleaned off, he dripped some of the glass bottle's medication onto his fingertips and rubbed them onto the wound. It stung like 100 needles, but Tereko kept from crying out. "Sorry, it'll hurt," Mother said. "I'm sorry this happened to you, Tereko. I never wanted you to get hurt so badly." "I'll be fine. It's really not a big deal," Tereko said. And really, it could have been much worse. A few bad scrapes wasn't anything to worry about, though telling his mother that would be kind of pointless. She kept a concerned look on her face, but didn't comment further on Tereko's injuries. He glanced out the window again and saw his father patting Turan on the shoulder. "You look like something's troubling you," Mother said. "Other than your wounds, I mean." Tereko wondered if his worries were that apparent. "It's nothing." Mother tilted her head a bit and gave this straight-lipped frown that meant Tereko's response simply wasn't going to cut it. "I wish I could make Father proud," Tereko whispered. "I was hoping to do a good job fighting that plant monster, but things didn't work out as nicely as I hoped." Mother nodded a couple of times and smiled. "Tereko, you've always been the hardest worker I've known. And that includes your father, believe it or not. Just keep fighting and you will definitely keep improving. That's more than enough to make your father and I very, very proud of you." Tereko turned his head and shut his eyes a few moments. "It doesn't feel like enough. Hard work doesn't mean anything if it doesn't bring results." Mother shook her head and gave a light little sigh. "Men tend to think that way. I think you'll learn for yourself that's not true, though, sea scrub." She didn't say any more on the matter, so Tereko didn't either. While Mother wrapped up his leg, Tereko took off his cloak and long-sleeved shirt so he could tend to the rest of his wounds. The cut across his chest wasn't too deep, fortunately, but it stung like crazy when he spread some of the ointment across it. "I finished the breakfast," Saran said as she walked into the room. "I'll keep it warm while—" Tereko looked up and found Saran frozen in mid-stride. Her eyes gazed down at Tereko's chest, and her entire face reddened. She quickly shut her eyes and scurried back to the kitchen. "Sorry, Tereko, I didn't mean—" Tereko couldn't help but smile at her modesty. "No need to apologize, Saran. You took part whenever our class went swimming. This isn't so different." "That was a few years ago," Saran said in a quiet voice. "You've grown since then." Mother tried to hide her amusement, though she made a poor effort of it. "Ah, you've caught her interest now," she whispered. "Your father used similar tactics, now that I think about it." Once Tereko finished tending his wounds, he went to his room to change into clothes that weren't bloodied up, and then joined everyone at the table for breakfast. Everyone simply pushed the lab materials toward the center of the table to make room for their plates, and Turan ate kneeling at the end of the table since there were only 4 chairs. Tereko sat by Saran, but couldn't think of anything very good to say to her other than thanking her for the meal. Turan kept up a loud conversation with Tereko's parents, so it was simpler to just eat. "I hope your injuries will get better quickly," Saran said quietly. Her thin eyebrows were arched upward, her face wearing such a worried expression. "I'm feeling better already," Tereko smiled. "I'm glad," Saran said. She finished breakfast about the same time as Tereko and stood up to give Tereko's parents a slight bow. "Thank you for letting me visit." "No, thank you," Mother said. "You cooked the meal and brought those elvish herbs. They will be a great help for the patients." "Oh, thanks," Saran said. Even when thanked, she instinctively thanked people for their thanks. "I'll help see you out," Tereko said, getting up. He followed her out the door and closed it behind them. "You shouldn't exert yourself," Saran said. "Can you walk all right?" "Yes, it doesn't hurt so much anymore," Tereko said. I mean, it never hurt that much," he thought. It was too late to change his words, though. "Well, I need to go help my brother with a couple things before school starts," Saran said. "See you in class." She waved goodbye and started to turn away. "Wait, there's something else," Tereko said. Saran stopped and tilted her head to the side. It was an adorable little gesture, and Tereko stumbled for the words to say. "There's the festival. The Long Shadow Festival is coming up." "Oh, yes," Saran said. "That's always fun with the shadow tracings and shadow puppet shows." "Yeah," Tereko said. "I was wondering, you're going, right?" "Mm-hmm," Saran hummed. "That's great," Tereko said. "I'll see you there then?" "Probably," Saran said. "It's a small town, so even with everyone gathered together, it's not too hard to see everyone." "No, that wasn't quite what I meant to say," Tereko thought. Saran smiled and waved again. "Though if we don't meet up there, I'll see you at school at least. See you later, Tereko." She was in a hurry for something, but had been nice enough to finish this conversation with Tereko. It didn't go the way he wanted it, though. He sighed and headed back inside, wondering when he'd get another good chance to talk with Saran privately. Perhaps at the festival? It was probably his next best opportunity, he decided. Tereko waited for Turan to finish breakfast, then gave his goodbyes to his parents before heading off to class. The long wooden school building was situated just outside of town, as there wasn't a good spot for it in the central square. It was one of the most recent structures in Adelerston, built just a few years after Tereko was born. Beforehand, groups of children were taught at teachers' homes and typically moved on to apprenticeships at an earlier age than was expected today. Today, there were more guidelines for what everyone in the country should learn, and the last couple days had given Tereko a lot of old poetry to memorize. Tereko much preferred learning more about ways to utilize Nexi Stones and other of the more magical subjects. Tereko and Turan crossed a series of radish fields and continued on down a trail that ran down an expansive turnip farm. Turan still had his leather armor and sword on him, so he'd probably get an earful from the teacher again about bringing a weapon to class. When Tereko brought it up, Turan just gave one of his many carefree, "don't worry about it" responses. Their idle chat turned to the inevitable within a few minutes, though. "So you set up a date with Saran at long last?" Turan asked. "Well, not quite," Tereko said. He knew this was coming, as Turan had been pestering him to set something up with Saran for some time now. "What?" Turan cried. He gripped his blonde hair and gave an exaggerated frown, though he only held this expression for a moment. "Come on, Tereko. I'll give you a deadline if I must. If you don't ask her out by Friday, I'll make a move myself." He closed his eyes and rubbed his chin with the back of his hand a few times. "Turan and Saran has a nice ring to it, don't you think? I bet I can win her heart in 3 days flat." Right, Tereko said. "Just like you've won the heart of every other girl in class." "Oh, wait, when was the last time you had a date?" Turan waved his hand toward Tereko's face. "Don't sweat the details. I'm just waiting for all the girls to finish fighting over me, and then I can just take the one left standing when the dust settles." Tereko stifled a laugh. "You might need to rethink that strategy of yours." "Yes, but seriously, Tereko." Turan's face turned serious. "You've got to make a move sometime with Saran. I mean, you've liked her since you were, what, 2? "Not that early," Tereko said. "But all right, I get your point. I'll see if I can find her at the festival and maybe take her to a hill to watch the fireworks with me." "Yes, girls love fireworks," Turan said. "But then again, I love them too. Most everyone does, I imagine," Tereko said. "I think everyone looks forward to the Long Shadow fireworks. Hey, speaking of fire," Turan pointed to a rising cloud of dark smoke in the distance. There were a number of houses and a couple of shops past this end of this field, not far from the school. Tereko instinctively took out a dark blue Nexi stone from his pocket. "Come on, we might be able to help put out whatever's caught on fire." He ran as fast as he could manage, though it sent painful jolts up and down his left leg with every step. As they approached the town outskirts, Terrico saw there were several buildings on fire, perhaps all of them. He glanced back at the central square in the far distance behind him and found smoke starting to rise there as well. The air filled with screams, cries for help, and weeping. It's an attack, Terrico realized. He wished he had a sword on hand like Turan, but he would have to make do with his Nexi Stones. He reached the nearest burning homes and found 3 dead bodies, each stabbed several times. A mother, a father, a child, all murdered beside their blazing home. Terrico was not familiar with this family, but he still recognized them. He gripped his Nexi Stone tight and searched furiously for the perpetrators. There was nobody around, though. The assailants were simply rushing through, killing everyone they could find. Turan ran off toward the burning shops down the road, and Terrico followed him, only to find more dead bodies. Terrico looked on ahead to find the school building also drenched in fire. Saran! Terrico bolted toward the school, running as hard as he could. He paid no mind to the pain of his injuries. He had to find Saran immediately. There were screams coming from inside. What if Saran was trapped amongst the flames? He had to get her out of there. He had to get all his classmates out of there. Everyone was counting on him. Terrico! Turan screamed. A little help! Terrico glanced back and stopped, surprised to find 2 armed men advancing on Turan from either side of him. Men in white uniforms and silver armor. Their defining element was the flat, featureless white mask each of them wore, which was entirely blank, save for an inverted black cross etched across the right eye. The Brotherhood, the most feared warriors of the Shire Kingdom. "Use your Nexi Stones!" Terrico yelled back. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Terrico was confident Turan could fend off these 2 warriors for a minute, while Terrico dealt with the fire in the school. There was no time to question his decision, not if Saran's life was on the line. Terrico bolted to the school building, which pulsated with hazy, painful waves of heat. He lifted up his dark blue Nexi Stone and forced it to activate with all the power he could muster. A great burst of water rushed forth from the stone, sweeping across the south wall and onto the roof. With the back entry doused, Terrico ran in and continued releasing as much water as he could from his Nexi Stone. The flames were powerful, and the fire was vast and overwhelming. It was going to be too difficult to put all of it out. "I have to find her. I have to reach her right now." He ran into the main hallway, where flaming planks of wood fell from the ceiling and crumbled atop blackened floorboards. Terrico put out some of the fire to make room for him to continue further into the building. His heart began to race faster when he realized that all the screams he had heard earlier had stopped. After drenching the door to the nearest classroom, Terrico kicked it down, only to find a burning inferno. He saw figures lying on the ground and aimed his Nexi Stone in their direction. The fires cleared, and Terrico found bodies littering the floor in terrible bloody piles. Students of all ages lay with gaping holes in their chests and stomachs. Incredulously, some were sliced clean in half. Terrico bent down and puked. It was all so impossible to believe. Terrico knew these people. They were his classmates, his fellow villagers, kids he was planning to play with at the festival. He coughed up smoke and nearly fell to his knees. "Have to get out of here," he thought. "Have to find Saran. Have to get out." The continual use of the Nexi Stone was draining him of energy. There was no way he'd be able to keep using it much longer. But he didn't see Saran amongst any of the bodies on the ground. He remembered she had said she needed to help her brother with something. She didn't say what, though. Terrico called out her name, but there was no answer. He yelled again and again, only to have his voice drowned out by the building's raging fires and crumbling structure. After beating down the door to another classroom, Terrico was nearly blown away by the heat that rushed through the entryway. He screamed from the sudden blast of searing heat and had to use the Nexi Stone on himself for a moment to keep from burning up. There was nothing to see inside the classroom. It was an utter hell that had already enveloped everything in its path. "Saran!" Terrico cried. He turned back to the hallway and yelled as hard as his smoke-filled lungs could handle, "Saran, are you there?" She wasn't anywhere. Tereko wanted to keep using his Nexi Stone to keep putting out as much fire as he could, but he was too weak to keep wielding so much water. And yet, he couldn't let himself just leave. What if Saran was in the next room? What if she could still be saved? The sound of screaming from outside jolted Tereko back to his senses. It was Taran. Tereko struggled to run down the hall, but was overwhelmed by the thick blankets of smoke developing in the building. He pushed himself to make it through until at last he stumbled out the building and fell to his hands and knees. For perhaps half a minute, Tereko fell into a painful coughing fit, helpless to assist his friend. He looked up and found Taran in combat with one of the Brotherhood warriors, fighting only a few meters ahead of Tereko. Farther ahead lay the body of the other warrior, whose marked face drooped in a puddle of blood leaking from his slit neck. Taran had managed to kill one warrior, but then tried to escape to the school building, but was unable to shake the second fighter. The enemy was a fast swordsman. Taran was barely managing to keep up with the man's attacks. It was clear Taran was terribly worn out. Tereko pushed himself to stand on his feet, but felt his head go dizzy for a couple seconds. He ignored the feeling and took out a white Nexi Stone. If he could blind the enemy with light for a moment, Taran would be able to slit the man's neck, just as he had the first warrior. The sound of movement came from the far end of the school building. Tereko glanced back and found a third Brotherhood member, this one wielding a long, jagged-edged sword in one hand and a fiery red Nexi Stone in the other. This had to be the man who burned down the building and perhaps slaughtered everyone within it. The man ran toward Tereko, raising his bloody, jagged sword forward. The enemy readied his swing, and Tereko leaped forward, thrusting his Nexi Stone toward the man's face while keeping his eyes on the man's sword. Tereko activated both his dark blue stone and the white one, simultaneously releasing a wave of water while blasting a sheet of blinding white light. At the same time, the enemy swung his sword and released a burst of fire from his Nexi Stone. Tereko shut his eyes, but knew precisely where the man's sword was. As Tereko's water devoured the enemy's fire, Tereko turned in place and ducked, letting the man's attack pass over him. Tereko immediately rose back up and jabbed his elbow into the man's stomach. As the brief flash of light faded away, Tereko wrenched the jagged sword from the man's grasp, spun in place, and stabbed him in the back with his own blade. The sound that emanated from the man's throat, something of shock and horror, crying from the suddenness of the pain, filling with blood, it was an utterly terrifying sound, lasting at least a full 5 seconds. Tereko shoved the man to the ground with a loud jaw-cracking thump, then pulled the sword from the corpse's back. It was the first time Tereko had ever killed someone, but there was no time to dwell on it now, not when the entire village was in danger. He turned back to Taran, who continued to fight against the same Brotherhood swordsman, a tall, imposing figure, though nameless behind the mask of the Shire organization. Tereko dropped his Nexi Stones, no longer able to keep a grip on them. He had exhausted himself with the fight against the plant monster that morning, and then drained himself even more when trying to put out the fire at the school. Gasping for air, Tereko fell to his knees once again, his entire body weak and trembling. He watched as Taran slipped out a brown Nexi Stone from his sleeve and aimed it for the enemy's feet. A dark, swamp-like substance flew from the stone, but the enemy had leaped back the moment Taran took out the rock. Taran swung for the man, who dodged and pulled an orange Nexi Stone out from a small belt pouch and clipped it in a slot in his sword's hilt. The man ran around the large, sticky marsh trap and charged for Taran, who lifted his Nexi Stone and aimed again. The man's sword glowed a bright orange. Even if Taran blocked the enemy's swing, the blade would cleave Taran's sword in two. Taran released more swamp material at the last moment, shooting the sticky substance all over the enemy's sword. It didn't stop the man from swinging, however. Turan turned and raised his sword to defend the man's still glowing blade. The man sliced Turan's blade clean in half, but was unable to continue the swing onto Turan's head. The swamp material connected the enemy's blade to the top of what was left of Turan's blade, and Turan held strong against the momentum of the man's swing. With the Brotherhood swordsman taken aback, Turan pulled his severed sword away, taking his enemy's sword with him. Turan immediately slipped out his red Nexi stone with his left hand and shot fire into the enemy's face. The man leaped back screaming and jumped straight onto the marsh trap Turan created earlier. Holding his sword with his right hand, Turan spun it so the enemy's sword at the end of Turan's blade pointed back to the enemy. Turan swung like a lumberjack and slammed the glowing blade straight through the enemy's body, slicing him down from his right shoulder to his left hip. With the man finally dead, Turan set the weapon and stones down and took slow, deep breaths. He recovered after just a few breaths, just as a man with long hair approached him. Tereko tried to get up to help Turan in case the man was with the Brotherhood, but it was too difficult to stand. The use of his Nexi Stones had curiously increased the pain of his wounds from the plant monster, and he fell into another terrible coughing fit as if he were still deep in the school full of smoke. The man walking toward Turan wore a small black vest, leaving his muscular arms and torso exposed. He wore a bandana and the kind of pants and leg guards found in the Shire Kingdom. But most startling were the bright green Nexi stones implanted up and down his arms, plus the light blue stone embedded in his right hand. There looked to be at least a dozen stones in total, and all of them glowed, ready to be utilized at a moment's notice. "You have talent," the man said, his voice quiet and monotone. "You will make a useful subject." Turan picked up his red Nexi stone and aimed it for this new enemy. Vines rushed out from all of the man's green Nexi stones simultaneously. Faster than Tereko could blink, the man held Turan in the air by 10 vines wrapped haphazardly all around Turan's body. Turan's red Nexi stone and sword was in the grasp of another of the man's vines, a safe distance away from Turan's grasp. Turan struggled against the vines for only a moment. The vines reacted instantly to his efforts, binding him even tighter. The vines pressed so hard against Turan's skin, Tereko could see his friend visibly in agony and even bleeding at places. "You have some skill with Nexi stones," the man went on, calm and placid. He almost sounded disinterested even. Before Turan could yell a retort, the man caused vines to wrap around Turan's head, forcing a gag to form across his mouth. Tereko wanted to run down to Turan, to pick up a sword and free him from those vines, but Tereko could hardly move, let alone fight a man who could wield a dozen Nexi stones at once. He tried to yell Turan's name, but couldn't even manage that. His dry throat kept him from projecting his voice above the cracking and roaring of the village fires. A couple masked Brotherhood members ran up to the man with his arms decked in Nexi stones. "There are more guards than expected at the central square, Commander Agurk," one of them said. The name was familiar to Tereko. Agurk Shire was one of the 2 brothers who led the Shire Kingdom, a heartless man who conducted all manner of inhuman experiments. There were many stories of his conquests and subsequent Nexi testing on his helpless victims, and even if a fraction of them were to be believed, Agurk was a man deserving of the utmost dread and fear. "We're finished here," Agurk said. "If my brother's men need help, we will assist them." Tereko watched as the 2 masked men ran off into the fields, followed by Agurk, who simply walked at a brisk, steady pace. Strangely, he seemed to be keeping up with the masked Brotherhood members just fine, however. Turan floated along behind him and to the side, held in the air by Agurk's strong, sturdy vines. "No, not Turan," Tereko thought. "I can't let you take Turan. I can't let you take him away for your sadistic experiments." He got himself to stand up, but felt the whole world start spinning beneath his feet. Tereko had never been so afflicted by the Nexi, though he recognized this was the most he had ever used the stones in such a brief period of time. His vision turned blurry for a few seconds, and he had to blink a few times before he could figure out which way he was facing. Terrico found the fields he had walked through to get to the school, but Agurk and Turan were nowhere in sight anymore. But even if he did find Turan, there were at least 3 Brotherhood fighters to deal with. Even if Terrico had energy to fight with, he'd be no match for 3 well-trained warriors. But he couldn't just do nothing either. Turan needed him. How could Terrico call himself Turan's friend if he just let Turan be taken away? Terrico gathered his Nexi Stones and picked up the jagged sword he had won. He looked back at the school, still burning, bright and miserable. "I'm sorry, Saran. I wasn't able to protect you." He trudged towards the fields, agony pulsating through his body every step of the way. "Turan, don't worry. I'll find you. And if you're still out there, I'll keep you safe too, Saran. And I'll help you as well, Mother and Father. The village will be all right. I will do everything I can. I will make everything right." Terrico's home was already burning by the time he came inside of it. Most of the wooden structure now a black, smoldering heap. There were no bodies lying outside the house, and Terrico knew his parents wouldn't be inside. He continued his way to the central square. His father would surely be at the cathedral, the site he and the town guards always planned to use for a base of resistance in the event of a full-scale attack. Mother was likely with him, perhaps directing villagers to safety. How many members of the Brotherhood came, Terrico wondered. As he trudged down the dirt road to the central square, he found nothing but bloodied corpses, scattered wares, and burning shops and homes. Fortunately, the cathedral had not caught on fire, giving Terrico some hope that the Brotherhood were being fended off. And why did they come here? There's nothing for them here. Most of the villagers had never worried too much about the Shire Kingdom's threats on the Fife's Kingdom, considering how insignificant Adelerston was in the grand scheme of things. This town was within the boundaries of the Fife's Kingdom, but that technically had very little impact on everyone's day-to-day lives. Terrico returned his thoughts to the matter at hand. It didn't matter why the Brotherhood had come. They just had to deal with it. Nearing the cathedral, Terrico found a number of town guards fighting off a few masked members of the Brotherhood. The enemies were strong and had access to powerful Nexi Stones, negating any advantage the guards may have had in terms of numbers. One by one, they were being killed off by the Brotherhood's superior tactics and better training. The guards needed help, but Terrico was too weakened to do much more. He needed to find his parents, and Turan, and Saran. Terrico quickened his pace, using all his willpower to fight against the stinging agony of his injuries. The pain seemed to be getting worse with every step, to the point where he began to feel dizzy again. He shut his eyes and forced himself up the white stone stairway to the open cathedral entrance. The sound of shattering windows echoed from within, followed by cries of panic. Terrico could hear a booming voice amongst the screams, but couldn't make out the words. He pushed himself up the steps faster. Once at the entry, Terrico found dozens of villagers scattering about the building. Terrico turned toward a stream of light pouring into the tall, dark cathedral, shining through the shattered hole that had housed the grand circular stained glass window. The light obscured the figure of a tall, imposing man wearing black armor, a cape, and a hood. Standing atop the holy altar, the man raised a sword nearly as tall as he was and pointed it down toward the aisle between the cathedral pews. "So that's your decision?" the man asked, his voice loud and booming. Terrico looked down and saw his father, standing a few meters in front of the man. Father raised his sword and caused it to glow with orange Nexi energy. "I know how you would use its power, Delcol," Father said. "I am not so spineless as to hand it over to you and let the blood of thousands rest on my hands in the process." Delcol? Delcol Shire, Terrico thought. It was incredulous that Agurk had come here, but Delco too? Why would both leaders of Shire Kingdom come to Adelerston, and what was Father talking about? Terrico turned and found Mother standing a couple of meters behind Father, gripping a couple Nexi Stones in her hands. "What are they doing?" "Blood will rest on your hands regardless," Delco yelled. You know what you have chosen. You have chosen to have every single person in this village die." Delco leaped off the altar, his sword in one hand, a glowing silver Nexi stone in the other. "Now!" Father yelled. Mother raised her Nexi stones toward Father, a clear one in her left hand, and then 2 stones in her right, a yellow one and a white one. The clear one would enable her to transfer the power of the other stones to Father and his sword. Terrico lifted the sword he had stolen and hurried down the long, echoing hall, refusing to just stand still while his parents were in danger. Father's sword glowed bright from the orange stone in his hilt, then charged the blade with white, blinding sparks of light. With his blade strengthened and the power of Mother's white Nexi stone, Father could yield the power of lightning. He swung his sword toward Delco, striking a deafening snap of lightning at the hooded figure. Delco already had his Nexi stone raised, however, and a floating barrier of metallic silver feathers blocked the attack. The lightning and shield both lasted only an instant, and Delco was quick to reach Father a moment later. They clashed swords, and a blinding burst of light enveloped the entire cathedral. Terrico jumped to the ground, his whole body numb from the wave of energy. The light cleared, but Terrico found it difficult to stand back up. His wounds seared with sheer torment, and his head pounded with a sudden migraine. He looked up at Father and Delco, struggling against one another with their blades. Delco's blade glowed silver, covered in etchings of feathers that shifted constantly. "I will admit your strength," Delco said. "You and that woman truly grasp the power of Nexi." A spray of white sparked against Delco's sword, as Father exerted himself to push against the silver blade. Father's body glowed a light yellow as Mother transferred a protective barrier of energy over his body. Delco's hood flipped back from the light gust of wind that emanated from the yellow glow. The man had short, light brown hair, eyes the color of gleaming blue ice, and some beard stubble. But what stood out most blatantly was the thick black scar across his right eye in the shape of an inverted cross. He cast a long, amused smile. "That won't be enough. My sword is already against yours." A Nexi stone on Delco's hilt glowed a bright, violent red. His sword burst into flames, blasting fire across Father's arms. Father yelled and stumbled back as the fire instantly covered the rest of his body. "No!" Mother screamed. All the energies of Father's and Mother's Nexi stones faded away. Delco chuckled, then lifted his sword and swung, taking a few steps forward in the process. Terrico's father and mother both dropped to the ground in one long swoop of his fiery silver blade. Delco beheaded them. In one simple motion, father and mother were dead. They were dead. And Terrico did nothing. He stared, wide-eyed, motionless. His mind went blank. What his eyes were seeing, it didn't make sense. What he saw didn't happen. It couldn't have. It couldn't have. Delco chuckled again as he turned to a group of villagers standing in shock a few meters away. "Is this the best this town offers? Or will the fun of the slaughter turn into the drudgery of the massacre?" A number of villagers ran for Delco, armed with only makeshift weapons, whatever knives they happened to have on them, or in some instances a farming tool. The silver feathers and crackling fire of Delco's blade faded away. He pocketed his silver Nexi stone and took out a dark purple one, which he slid down the length of the blade. The sword began to vibrate violently with glowing purple energy, but Delco held it so tight that the weapon had no effect on his body. 3 men charged for Delco from different directions. Delco swung his sword against the nearest man, slamming the flat side of the blade against the man's chest. The villager flew backward from the impact, careening backward several meters. At the same time, Delco caused his purple Nexi stone to power his kick against the next man's stomach. This man also went flying backward, arcing several meters into the air. Then, in one brief instant, Delco turned his blade to point for the third man, an elderly man with a fishing knife. The villager ran straight into Delco's blade. Delco laughed as he caused his sword to vibrate faster. tearing the old man apart from the inside. A group of villagers swarmed for Delcol, screaming with sheer rage. Delcol simply swung away with the broadside of his sword, letting the power of his Nexi Stone fling everyone through the air. He knocked a young boy against an altar, then turned and slammed his blade against a woman's head, snapping her neck. In long, swift movements, he beat his blade against a green-haired boy Terrico's age, then against a man with one leg trying to slip away, then against a girl perhaps 4 or 5 years old. Everyone within Delcol's range died in a swift, bloody death, screaming and crying. Terrico saw it all happen, but it somehow didn't mean anything. These were just things that were happening. Delcol killed everyone, and nobody could even lay a finger on him. In fact, this was just a game to him, a very easy game, one that he always won and always enjoyed winning. Masked Brotherhood members rushed into the cathedral, easily taking down any villagers who tried to escape. The church echoed with a cacophony of grisly horror, and Terrico did nothing. He lay there, unthinking, unmoving. Bodies and body parts were strewn all across the floor or draped over the pews. A couple corpses and a severed arm landed around Terrico over the course of the slaughter, and once it was all over, Delcol apparently didn't notice Terrico lying there, still alive. "Your brother is waiting outside," a Brotherhood member told Delcol. "Begin a thorough search of the entire village," Delco said. "Sift through the ashes of every single hovel. If the Elpis is here, I intend to find it." Terrico listened to the footsteps of Delcol and his men marching down the stairway. Terrico remained where he lay, motionless, silent. Hours passed, and still Terrico lay on the cold stone floor of the cathedral, hardly able to breathe amidst the stench of the dead. He shut his eyes and gripped his hands into fists. Though he lay soundless, Terrico cursed himself. He cursed Delco, and he cursed himself. "He killed my parents. He murdered them. He laughed. He killed them, and he loved killing them. And I did nothing. I did nothing. I did nothing." Hour after hour passed, and Terrico cursed himself for lacking the power to do anything. Terrico's entire world was destroyed, and he failed to do absolutely anything about it. "My parents are dead. Turan is captured and will probably die. Saran is missing, but is probably dead." Terrico knew that each of these thoughts should have been enough to move him to tears, but he didn't want tears. He wanted to be moved to action. He wanted to do something about this. He cursed himself until his whole body trembled. "Delcol! Delcol! Delcol!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. Though utterly exhausted, Terrico willed himself to push aside the corpse draped across him and stood up. He nearly fell back down from lightheadedness, and it took a few seconds for his blackened vision to clear. "The entire village is destroyed. Perhaps everyone I know is dead. I will avenge you all. Father, Mother, Turan, Saran, I will make things right." Terrico bent down and wearily picked up the jagged sword he earned from the man he killed. It was frigid in his bloody hands, but it filled him with energy, with a will to hew down Delcol and every single one of his followers. "I swear I will kill you, Delcol. I will kill you, and I will destroy your brotherhood, and I will relish every single second of it."